Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to present to you the next three speakers, namely Elizabeth O'Donoghue-Ross, Nigel McCarthy and Finbar O Mahony. And together they are presenting on the Munster Irish project, which is one of the most elegantly executed geographical projects on family tree DNA. And this project aims to explore the genetic signatures found in the south of Ireland, the relationships between the various surnames there, and how the DNA evidence compares to the ancient genealogies. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Elizabeth, Finbar and Nigel.
As Morris has explained, the three of us are administrators for this project that we started a couple of years ago. Nigel and Finbar will help me through this all. They're fine examples of Munstermen, and I married one. So we have a very vested interest in pursuing this project. The objectives are to study the context of the common ancestors and relationships between the tribes in Tua found in the province. Let me get it right. Here is the website address for our project at Family Tree. Now, the information that you'll see on the slides is either on the project website already or will be shortly. So if I go through slides rather quickly, you don't have to worry about that. Now, in order to decide who we were going to invite to join this project, we studied a number of genealogical sources. The top three are the most important insofar as they're the oldest, but we used a combination of other sources as well to help us identify all the names that we wanted to try to get to participate. And there's a list. Now, that's a huge list. There's probably more than that now since we actually created the slide. We don't have members from all of them yet, but hopefully at some stage we might. In order to join the project, the participant has to bear one of our listed surnames or a variation of it, have a most distant paternal ancestor identified as having been born in Munster, or have a Y-DNA genetic signature similar to the three currently identified, which you'll hear more about later. The goals of the project: to provide a source of general information for those with a scholarly interest in the genealogical history of the peoples of Munster, to provide an assembly of raw Y-DNA pertaining to the peoples of Munster, to identify distinct ancestral haplotypes present in the province, and to relate these ancestral haplotypes to the ancient genealogies, annals, and other historical documents, and in so doing, verify or clarify the pedigrees described in those various genealogical tracts. Now, to put in context of who the men of Munster might be, we first have to consider as well a combination perhaps of the origin myths for who they are, as well as what evidence archaeology, history, and language might offer us. Now, from the standpoint of the origin myths, there's a number of tales that can be found in different tracts throughout Irish literature. The Laur, Gawala, not Era, did I get that right? The Book of Invasions, or more literally the Book of the Taking of Ireland, is a very main source. And in the 19th century, it was considered a Bible, that what they said in there was the truth. Now, scholars since then have not only debunked it, but suggested it's mere fiction. But my own feeling has always been that where there's smoke, there's fire. If Heinrich Schliemann hadn't paid any attention to Homer, he probably never would have found Troy. So I'm all for believing that there is some evidence in there that might be worthwhile. Just very briefly, it talks about 6 different invasions, starting with Césaire and her followers, who is supposed to have been Noah's granddaughter, arriving after the flood, going all the way down to the Milesians, when more of you might be familiar with the Milesian myth. There's various renditions of it. To just very briefly give you some notion of what it means. The Milesians come from one gentleman named Milaspaña, the Spanish soldier. He was also referred to as Gallo, Gale. There's bound to be a connection there. Very briefly, he left Spain and traveled to the eastern regions of the Celtic territories, all the way up to the Black Sea. Supposedly, he visited the land of the royal Scythians, married a Scythian princess, had some sons. Then he went down to Egypt, married Pharaoh's daughter, had some more sons. Then he finally made his way all the way back up to Spain, where he came from, married a princess, a Spanish princess, and had still more sons. Now, all of these sons were there in Spain at that point, and when Uncle If traveled up to the Tower of Bregon, supposedly on a clear day, he saw Ireland. And so the sons said, gee, that looks interesting, why don't we go there? So they did. Now, from a standpoint of the archaeological records and history and language, there's a lot of theories. No one necessarily agrees with much of it. They all have their own little bits of theories, but they're all kind of interesting. The one thing that most people do agree with is that the earliest settlers arrived about 10,000 years ago. But they basically arrived over in the north of the island rather than Munster. Now, where did they come from? A lot of people believe that they came from the continent over across England and into Ireland. But there has always been an archaeological difference between the north and the south, and there's no reason not to believe that some of them traveled from Spain, which is where Uncle Ith was, perhaps southern France all the way up to Brittany, by sea to come to Munster. There was plenty of travel by sea then, so it certainly wasn't any obstacle. Now, I'm going to bring you to Ireland in the 2nd century AD. This map is a mythical one. This map is a real one. At the time that we're talking about, the island was divided between the north and the south. There was a division line called the Escarriata, which is literally the terminal moraine of the ice sheet that covered Ireland during the last ice age. The top half was under the control of Conn of the Hundred Battles, and Mug's half was under the control of Magnua, aka Owen More. Conn's descendants were the Connachtá of the north, and Owen Moore's were the Eoghanacht of the south. Now, at this time, there were no written records in Ireland itself, but in Greece, there were plenty of written records, and this includes a whole bunch of maps that Ptolemy was making of the whole world. Now, he never visited Ireland himself, so it would have been mariners he might have been speaking to, and charts that might have been current at that time, and he created a map showing all the tribes that supposedly were living in Ireland at that point. Now, most of them bear no relevance to anything we know today, and they could have been quite garbled by the time they got to him. But just as an example to see that it's not worthless, is that there's a Brigantes tribe down here, which was also present in England, and there's the Cruin, are the Irish word for Picts, which would have been Scottish. So at least we can see them coming across in both directions for those tribes. What the rest of them mean is kind of hard to know. Now, if we focus on Munster, here's a Munster map, and it shows you some, not all, but some of the tribes that traditionally were present in Munster before the Eoghanacht became terribly powerful. You'll see them listed here, there in the next square, and the Corca was the most powerful of the tribes at that time and had control over a very vast area of Munster. Now, as I say, this is pre-Eoghanacht. Once the Eoghanacht, whoever they are, started to gain hegemony and control of the south in general, you'll see that we have a whole bunch of Eoghanacht branches all over the place, kind of in the middle where the Corca used to be. And they got pushed back till they're down here in the little southwest corner. This would have been up to around the 11th century, and by that time, there are those who believe that it was more recent, that the Dacia, am I pronouncing that right, Finbar? Okay, the Dacia was a set of tribes that traveled, well, they didn't travel, but they had territories from Waterford up through Tipperary and through Limerick and all the way up to Clare, and the Dalcassian would have been the tribe that eventually bore Brian Boru. There's also a little tribe up here called the Ely that would have been considered part of Munster at that time. It isn't anymore, it belongs to Leinster. Leinster, but I'm keeping it in there because once it did belong to us. Now, this is a list of surnames. This isn't all of them by any stretch that are present in Munster, but it does include everybody we have in the project at the moment. As we gain more people, hopefully we will see the time come when we have even more names to put in. Now, having given you the background there, I'm going to pass the clicker over to Nigel and then to Finbar, and they'll share some of the results and discoveries that we've gotten from the project through the time we've been working on it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Here, you want this?
Okay, thank you. Okay, the way we started this project, we wrote to a lot of, as many projects, other projects as we could that had, we felt participants which could have Munster background, and we invited them, the administrators, to contact their populace and join our project as well. So it's not random selection, it's the project is self-selected in that extent. Since then, we've obviously had people joining at will, and slowly as we build up the membership, we have a more representative sample. It's been said several times in the last couple of days that surnames with one eponymous ancestor, or monogenetic surnames, quite often dominate with one haplotype, which is about 50 to 60% of the name. Give you a good example, the Sullivans. Sullivan is a name occasionally derived up in the north of Ireland from a different source, but most Sullivans are derived from one particular name, Sullivan with a nickname, one-eyed or hawk-eyed, from Eoghanacht, who lived in the first millennium, and you'll find that about 55% of Sullivans, maybe even 60%, have common ancestry going back to somebody about that time. So that is consistent with the what's written in the ancient genealogies. Whereas surnames with multiple sources, such as the O'Donohues, O'Donoghue is a name which comes up in different parts of Ireland. There's a number of different origins for O'Donohues because they came from a very common forename, O'Donoghue, and so if you look at O'Donohues Ireland-wide, you don't find any that is a particular large group. In the context of Munster, we're actually looking at only two sources of O'Donohues. Just a short word about, for those of you that are strange to this, I mean, I hope a lot of you have been to the beginners lectures that have started off each day. But when we're looking at DNA and why DNA, we're looking at two types of change in the DNA. Changes are called mutations. The main change on the right is what we call SNPs. They're the markers in the sand that actually define haplogroups. They are almost never reversible, and they're give you the definition. Go right back to Africa. This is how geneticists have gone right back to Africa and traced mankind's travels throughout the world. They are denoted by SNP numbers such as IL161.1, an alternative designation which, if you've taken tests with FTDNA, you'll be familiar with, is to the I2, A1, B2 and things like that. That's an alternative way of doing it. That designation can change from one company to another. It can also change from 1 month to the next as the science develops, whereas the SNP designation is fixed, so that's a more reliable one. That goes back, as I say, it goes all the way back to Africa, and it comes forward to up to, at the moment, a definition about 1,000 to 3,000 years ago. In the future, it will take us right down to the present day. But the first results you get when you take an FTDNA test are your YSTR markers, single tandem repeats, which are repeating molecules at the various parts of the chromosome. And sometimes you lose one of these, and sometimes you gain one of these. And the number of repeats you have at any location are given by these numbers. We're all doing this. The 13, 23, 14, 11, 11, these are the counts of the number of molecules you have at different locations on the chromosome. And it's here, a subtle change in these every now and then, which is called a mutation, and that's the way we divide you up in the detail of the last few thousand years since the last SNP associated with your haplotype. This is a wonderful tree that is maintained on the internet by Mike Walsh, who's a fantastic devotee to the R-L21 haplogroup, which accounts for about 80% of Irishmen, 40 to 50% of Englishmen, maybe more, and quite a lot of Western Europeans and Spaniards, and even east of that in smaller numbers. The SNPs, the key markers, are L21, divides into two. 95% have DF13, 5% have DF63, and then under DF13 you'll find 15 different SNPs. It's like a population explosion, if you like. These are spread out all over Europe. Some of these are particularly prevalent in Ireland, and others are not. In particular in Ireland you have DF49, this stream down here in the north of Ireland. A particular interest to our project is Z226. I'll be talking about that in a moment. Yeah. Z226, which is here under Z253. DF21 goes down here to L362. Over the far side, CTS446. These are particular branches of the tree which we're interested in Munster. There are others, and I'll talk about those in due course. So the main subclades in Munster are that we started out in this project. We identified these as specific to Munster, and we were very interested to have anybody with this DNA that also had Munster origins in the project. That's not the limit, but that's the way we've started, and we're looking for more as we go on. So CTS 4466, Irish type 2 or South Irish. Within the last 12 months, we've identified not just CTS 446, but some other SNPs associated with this. 5914, 3974. There's another one, CTS 8358. F2517, some of you, this might be total nonsense, but these are the numbers. And there's one or two which are very, very specific to, that have been tested, but are very, very recent in families, so they're perhaps not of interest in looking at the history of Munster. They're found in Munster surnames claimed to be of Eoghanacht origins in the ancient genealogical tracts. McCarthy, O'Donoghue, O'Keefe, O Mahony, O'Moriarty, O'Sullivan, and there's many others. Dailies comes, there's a lot of Dailies with this, McAuliffes and so on. We've also found them in English and Scottish names. We still have some more work to do identifying how that came to be. But of course we have to take account, there was always, even in the first millennium, there was people going to and fro across the Irish Sea. There's all sorts of invasions one way or the other, so there's many explanations. They're purported to descend in the ancient genealogical tracts from Owen More, the son of Aliel Olam, who was the king of Munster in the 3rd century. And this is where they got the Eoghanacht name from. And this is probably the largest of the 3 haplotypes we've identified in Munster. The second one, Irish type 3, which is also known as Dalcassian, is associated with the O'Briens, Hogans, Kennedys, and relates to Brian Boru. But it's also found in a lot of other names. But it is particularly prevalent in Clare and Limerick, North Munster, or Thomond. Again, it's occasionally found in England and Scotland, but very little on the continent. And this is purported to descend from Cormac Cass. Now, in the mythology or the ancient legends, Cormac Cass was a son of Oliel Olam and a brother of Owen Moore. But certainly from the DNA, that is totally impossible. They could not be related because this one and the previous one, Irish type 2, are unrelated, going back to 3,000 years or perhaps more. But this is L226 is quite a young subclade. I think Elizabeth will talk a bit about the ages later on. And finally, Munster type 1, which is very specific. This is SNP L362, which is on a tree under P314.2. There are about 155 people with P314.2 in the database of 330,000. Probably about 30 or 40 have L362, or a haplotype that we predict will be L362, and a very large proportion of these are McCarthy's. So this is very likely to have arisen not too long before surnames came into use, because otherwise we'd expect a much bigger diversity of names. There are other names associated with this. There are some O'Callaghan's, not the main O'Callaghan name, but there are a small group of O'Callaghan's. There's a Carey, a Kelly, a Long, which is another Eoghanacht name coming from O'Lonshig. O Mahony, there's an O'Shea or two, even though O'Shea's normally are found in a different group, and O'Sullivan's. And so far, L362 has only been seen in Munster or with association with Munster origins. What we're doing with the data we've got, and we're still in our infancy with this, we're looking for more specific haplotypes which are, we feel that are embedded in Munster, that have occurred in Munster or have their origins in Munster. For instance, L513 is an SNP which is going back 3,000 years or so, 3,500 years, has branches spreading out all over the place. But among them, and a lot of those branches have SNPs which actually define them. But there's a large group of O'Shea's around Dingle Bay. There's a few McCarthy's in it and a Coleman in it that clearly come from L513, but have a particular lineage which comes down into the first millennium. And from that point, it's very specific to O'Shea, mainly to O'Shea's with a few hangers-on, but also have Munster names. So that looks like that particular lineage, which I'm tagging Dingle Bay variant of L513 or Eoghanacht variant, but that's subject to a selection of what we like to call it. That's of great interest, and we hope perhaps we can define that as a specific haplotype of interest to us. I2A, which is completely different, it's not in the RL21 at all. It goes back 30,000 years before the Ice Age, but this is particularly prevalent in West Cork, and the 55% of O'Driscolls have this. There's one or two others have it, but I2A is spread out all over Western Europe. But we're looking particularly, there is just one particular STR mutation, which occurs if you extend to 111 markers. You see a particular mutation there, which is 11 to 9 on the particular segment. 11 to 9 mutations, repeats of the STR repeat, which seems to be specific to the West Cork version of I2A. We need more people to test, and ideally we'd like a few more other than O'Driscolls to see if we can find it in other names. That's potentially is going to be a marker for West Cork, as yet unproven. The Leinster C or Irish C, the Leinster or Irish C model, which is associated with Z255 and also sometimes with SNP L159.2. I've said likely to be a Viking origin. I should really say possibly Viking origin, because there are a bunch of Norwegians that share this. And that makes sense. We have it's particular strongly around the Irish Sea. It would make sense, maybe that's Viking. But we have to take the alternative view. It could be Irish slaves exported to Norway, because there was a lot of people taken away to Norway. So it could have gone the other way. It could have been originated in Ireland and ended up in Norway because of the people were taken as slaves. Finally, L144 is a very, very specific branch of the L21 tree, or DF13 tree, and it's very specific to a few names. In Ireland, it's the Whelan or Phelan or Phelan name associated with the Déisi Moon. As Elizabeth explained, this is partly in Munster and it's partly further north. I mean, some say they were driven down the expulsion of the Déisi from the Midlands, from Meath down to Waterford and so on. It's still very prevalent in Laois and Kilkenny, Offaly, but also in Waterford. That's very specific to that name, except for over in England, there's a name there's dozens of them which have a very similar haplotype, and the name is Bracewell, largely in Lancashire, but also across in Yorkshire. Now, there is a common Irish name of the past was Brasil, and the name Brazil, its surname Brazil occurs occasionally in Ireland. At the moment, all the examples are of Bracewell and variants that are occurring in England, but it clearly has a strong connection with the Whelan or Phelans, and we're still investigating that. And we'd be very interested to have some Irish Brazils test. And okay, thank you, sir. Well done. Okay. Oops. And that's my little bit finished. I'm going to hand you over to Finbar, who's going to talk a bit more about the distributions.
Thank you, Nigel. Just as a matter of interest, I have a letter at home written to or by a Bracewell, and the Bracewells were related to Florence Nightingale, so good connections. I'm Finbar, right? Just quickly, so basically what we're looking at is what about the other haplotypes and subclades that we found? Where do the current participants live? Do the DNA clusters and subclades compare with the tribal territories? I suppose it's a superfluous question to ask where do the men of Munster live. They live in Munster. But what we're trying to sort out is, are they associated with the ancient tribal territories? So I'll move along fairly quickly. As anyone who attended the earlier talk gathered, I tend to talk a little bit longer than the slide will allow, so I'm going to discipline myself. So the haplogroups, subclades in the project, we've seen them there, a G, which is, back to the old one. Did the men of Munster annihilate all of the Gs? No, there's still some around. So it's dangerous to come to conclusions on the basis of 3 ancient skeletons, as a gentleman recently published in a so-called academic paper. I2A, again, as Nigel has suggested, is remnants of ancient people still very much with us. My best friend is Kieran O'Driscoll. I'm glad he's still around. So they're in there among the men of Munster, and especially along the south coast. And we can go each of them, the majority through each of them on the website if you wish. The chart shows you their relative strength or power or dominance, but basically here we have them, the Irish type 2 or the South Irish, we have 53 examples. But we also have in the Munster project 24 Dalcassians or the Irish type 3. So the important thing is to realize that minority groups in terms of representation by haplotype, you should not jump to the conclusion that that's all there is or that is the relative strength in Munster or throughout the world. It's a self-selecting group, non-random, and we need many, many more people before we can arrive at a proper distribution on a chart like this. Okay, it's the old black swan principle, you know. Until they discovered New South Wales, we thought swans were white. Let's get many, many more people involved, and then we'll see what the actual numbers really look like. Again, this is going to be up on the website. No doubt it will also be up on YouTube tonight. Tune in and see. But you will see, again, how the numbers break out by name. The O'Briens, who are associated with the Dalcassian, the O'Callaghan's, the O'Cashel, the McCarthys, O'Cashel, the Corkalee, O'Coffeys, Corkalee, the O'Collinses, so Susan Beretta will be happy. The O'Gratland, the O'Donohues, the O'Mahonys, and so on. Now, standing here today, or this afternoon, I'm very pleased to be able to associate myself with two representatives of the McCarthy and O'Donoghue clans. You see, in the old days, those were the individuals that were very closely associated with the O'Mahonys. When one branch of the O'Mahonys left West Cork and went to Killarney, they received the hospitality of McCarthy Moore, who gave them lands south of the lakes of Killarney. He pushed the O'Donoghues a little bit over the mountains into the Glenflesk area, the story goes. So we're bound together by history. That's effectively what we're looking at as well, relationships between the tribes or septs and the subdivisions within each of those. The O'Keefes, the Glanworth, and then the O'Mahonys of the Rathland, I should say. So it goes. So that's the number in terms of the spreadsheet. We would love to see those cells fill up more and more as the sample increases. So please get active, get tested, and join. So where do the present-day men of Munster live? The way we did this is quite simply, we ask individuals, what is your earliest known ancestor? And then there's a freely available map on which you can pin the location, and that's exactly what we did for the following tribes, if you wish. So the three Munster subclades that are the predominant ones, South Irish type 2, you can see the distribution there. And where do you think it's found? South Ireland, Munster. Then we have the Irish type 3. Now, within that cluster, you also have a very strong group of the North Cork O'Mahonys. But you can see that the Irish type 3 is spread around, again, Munster, and across into what could be described a little bit further north as the old Munster territories. And then the Munster Irish, Munster type 1, or the Irish type 1, here again, a distribution. But there's one thing that's obvious, and if you superimpose each of those maps, one upon the other, you will see that they would have lived, as we say, as Gaeilge, fuite. They were mixed, but there were distinct territories nonetheless. Territories. But it wasn't all a question of territories as such, it was association with an identity. And I think that's the other thing we have to consider. Right? So we're learning. So currently in the project, we have representative names from each of those tribes. You have the Corkaguina, the O'Connells and the O'Sheas. The Corkalee, Coffey, Collins, O'Dunban, O'Driscoll and O'Leary. The Dalcassians, as Nigel said, we have the O'Briens, the Hogans, Kennedys and Toomeys. Then the Déisi Moon, the Foleys, O'Donohues, the Whelans, or O'Fuelons. And then the Eli Carl, you've got Maher and O'Maher. The O'Donia, the Irwins, Kerwicks and Kirbys. Now I'm sure are familiar with some of the old legends. Back in 1972, I joined a company. I had got a fantastic job. And my assistant drove me around to introduce me to the various locations. And one of the places we visited was Kilmallock. But on the way, I was brought on a tour of Loch Gur. Very lonely, isolated place. But it's one of the homelands or ancient seats of the O'Doina. And there's some lovely legends associated with the origins of the tribe. You should read them, they're fascinating. It's somewhat gory in some ways and less than pleasant in some aspects. The The O'Cashel, let's go on here. Here we have the O'Callaghan's, McCarthy's, O'Donoghue's of the Glen, and then the O'Sullivans, and then the Glanworth, Glanworth, the O'Keefe's. My maternal grandfather was a Moriarty, Daniel Moriarty, and that's why I've started the Moriarty YDNA project as well. The O'Nough de Ratland, the O'Donoghue Moore, the O'Longs, the O'Mahonys, the O'Neills, and so on. So here we have a very strong representation of that branch, and you could easily assume that they dominated. No, it's nothing to do with that. This is the old one of, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. If more O'Mahonys joined the project, it doesn't mean there are more O'Mahonys around. They were just joined. So we have to try and get a statistical balance in the project and have adequate and proper representation of each of the groups. That's why we're interested in increasing the numbers. And then the O'Nough to Ross Harrogate, you have the O'Maras. So that's where they were. Tribal groupings, then the tribal territories, the O'Cashel represented there, the O'Nough Rathland spread around, as we can see, widely distributed, but you can see the overlaps. And then we have the O'Nough Lane, very small representation of that particular tribe, and you have the Onya and Ross Harrogate and so on. Small numbers, more representation needed, but associated nonetheless with what could be described as the ancient tribal territories. So the Dalcassians, or the Irish type 3s, that's an in-joke. Right, the Dalcassians and the Irish type 3, you can see relatively few spread out there into Clare. That is not because they're not from Clare or found in Clare, just two good examples who could pinpoint the early ancestor. So you have Limerick, Clare, North Cork, South Tipperary, across into Waterford. That is the swathe of influence of what could be described as the Irish type 3 or the Dalcassians. And we want to see more in the project to get the right balance. And then the Déisi Moon and the Eli, here the greens and the golds, separating them out. And then the Kirkalee and the Kirkaguina. The lavender, as you can see, will give you the Kirkaguina, and the red, the Kirkalee. So that's where they're found, and the question is, A, are they descended from the tribes to which they are ascribed by surname, and are the tribes still found within the lands associated with them from ancient times? I think the pattern is emerging, as you can see, and I'll basically leave it to Elizabeth to talk about that. So we're looking at the interrelationships. That's what we're looking at. And it isn't a question of each of the names being watertight compartments. The tribes, similarly, were not watertight compartments. I've said in respect of the O'Mahonys, the tribe seemed to, or the sect seemed to have adopted the attitude, if you're in, you're in. If you say you're in, you're one of us. And there are a whole range of reasons why you would have such diversity in the sects or clans. So the tribes, they're found more or less within the general area of historic territories associated with the ancient tribes. The haplotypes, the next point, the South Irish type 2 are found in 8 of the tribes, and the Irish type 3 are found in 6 of the tribes, and then the Munster Irish type 1, that's found in 2 of the tribes, and both of those tribes are O'Nough. Right? So, have we found the men of Munster? I'll hand over to Elizabeth for that. Thank you.
Turn me back on.
There we go.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Okay. So, have we found the men of Munster? Well, to a degree, we probably have. To a degree, we're still looking. We have the 3 Munster haplotypes. We're still searching for more. Hopefully, in the relatively near future, we'll feel confident enough to identify L144, a segment of it or whatever, that we can add to the list of Munster haplotypes that we're including in our project. Is there any sign of those Milesian Gaels? Now, there is archaeological evidence that makes it clear that there was a connection, particularly with Munster, through trade and culture, with the Byzantine Empire, which, of course, is way over in the east. Unfortunately, if you follow the theory of Gallo traveling east, coming back again, we're still talking about the same type of genetic signature. It's not like the Eastern Celts were any different. So that makes it pretty difficult to be able to identify that one is in the east and one isn't. So it's a little bit up in the air. Are there any hints of Spain? Spain, unfortunately, is rather underrepresented in the database, so that makes it a little bit harder to determine anything. There are a few possible South Irish haplotypes with Spanish antecedents. I haven't convinced them to test to determine whether they are of the proper subclade, to be sure. But even if they were, there's so few of them, we could just write them off as Irish blow-ins from Ireland itself, so there's no real way to be able to tell whether there's any Spanish connections at this stage. So what does the data tell us? We've got our 3 subclades. We know from the statistics that Finbar shared with us that not all of the Eoghanacht are South Irish, but other tribes are South Irish too. So that does suggest something. We do know that the Dalcassians, the Dalcassians, the Brian Boru contingent, the Daishamuan, and the Ely are a different haplotype altogether. In addition to that, there are 3 families that have some very interesting, unique haplotypes to them that differ from the vast majority of them. The O'Callahans are the first. Their progenitor is supposed to be the progenitor of the McCarthys, as well as the Cashel O'Donohues. It turns out they have a rather small project, unfortunately, but they only have 1 South Irish representative in it. What's really strange is that 30% of them are Irish type 3, which is connected to the Dalcassians. That I haven't been able to figure out yet at all. But they do have a few L362, which is interesting insofar as Nigel pointed out, 29% of the McCarthys are L362. So there must be some connection there. And the McCarthys also have 21% of the South Irish, so that's not a surprise either. Now, the last interesting thing is that there are 2 Kerry Eoghanachts that are O'Donohues. The Glens are Cashel, the Moore are Rathlin. The Glens group are indeed South Irish, which you would expect and not a surprise. But the families that live closer to Killarney that are identified as O'Donoghue Moore are not South Irish, and some of them who have tested for the SNPs are DF25 and DF5, which again is something totally different. Now, the one curious fact is that L362 and DF25 and DF5 all are downstream SNPs from a larger subclade of DF21, which again is something very different. So this is something we will continue to explore to see what it might mean. It has to mean something. From a standpoint of what origins we have, with the South Irish type 2, although it's generally considered as an Eoghanacht, and there is an Eoghanacht project that focuses on that to a degree, because there are other tribes that are supposed to be older than the Eoghanachts, it's difficult to suggest that it is an Eoghanacht signature, and we're assuming that it probably originated in Munster, as opposed to Eastern Celts coming over in the Milesian myth. With the Dalcassian type 3, they are almost surely originated amongst the Daoise tribes that are based in Munster. And the Munster type 1, the question is, could they be remnants of the Gaels? Who knows? Maybe they are. They could be more recent, originating in Munster. They don't seem to be too old, as Nigel pointed out, perhaps at least a little bit before the first millennium AD. But again, we don't know yet, and that's something that we will continue studying. TMRCA, the time to the most recent common ancestor, the ages of the Munster subclades. Anytime I start thinking about ages and dates, I think of the Mark Twain adage that Finbar already mentioned. There are lies, damned lies, and then there are statistics. Statistics can only be probabilities. And there are so many factors that are difficult to identify that I haven't myself made any effort to try to date any of these subclades, but others have. And oops, I did it again, sorry. What did I do? I made a mess. Right, okay, we're gonna have to go through them all. Can you? Yeah, go down to the end. Very sorry, folks. That's it, okay. The South Irish type 2, it's been suggested that it originated around the 2nd century AD. I'm pretty comfortable it's probably much older than that. The Dalcassian type 3, it's been suggested maybe between the 7th and 10th centuries AD, but even Dennis Wright, who administers that project, feels it is probably older than that. With the Munster type 1, that's a bit more difficult because we have so few that we have clearly identified to be L362. So we can't really gauge at this stage with any kind of surety how old it might be. But because of the variation in surnames, it probably has to be before surnames develop, which would be before the 1st millennium. So have we reached our goals? I'm probably getting close for time here. So yes. Yes, oops, oh gosh, I did it again. What do I need to do? Forgive me, folks. Right, okay. All right, I think we've reached, I give up. I give up.
Use the arrows, that might be.
Yeah, okay.
I
Okay, I promise not to do that again. Okay, the first few goals, yes, I'm comfortable that we have. We're looking for more distinct ancestral haplotypes. But the interesting point, I think, is that we've confirmed that the ancient genealogies, annals, and other historical documents have, over time, to a degree, been redacted, altered, or just plain fabricated for political or cultural purposes. Nevertheless, there are some instances of these same tracts providing explanations for otherwise incongruent findings to make any sense. So that's good to know. Plans. We always have plans. We hope to launch a second website that will include additional information, charts, spreadsheets, and other data that is difficult to try to load onto the family tree website itself. We have a target date for the 1st of November. Hopefully we'll get there. We will post on our website when the second site is available. So if any of you are curious after the November 1st, you can take a peek and see whether we've actually got it uploaded yet. We hope to continue recruiting, expand our criteria for adding surnames to the project. This is a personal thing of mine. I hope we can attempt to encourage more chiefs of the name to take the risk of having their Y-DNA tested to hopefully serve as a benchmark for their plan. There are only 2 hereditary chiefs so far who have been brave enough to test: Conor the O'Brien and Geoffrey Paul the O'Donoghue the Glens. Now, Geoffrey's son suggested at the get-go, he said, why would you do this? You have nothing to gain, you have a hereditary title already, you have everything to lose if it turns out that your DNA does not match up with what you think it should be. But these 2 men were brave, and hope we can find more, because these chiefs don't have much to offer their clans anymore. They don't have any territories, they don't have any power, but at least they have their DNA, which is their genetic heritage, that we should be aware of too. So I'm only hoping we can get more to test. Now, in addition to that, the last point is that we are in the midst of creating a haplogroup project for the CTS 4466, which identifies the South Irish, and with the expectation to explore more methodically the parameters and origins of the South Irish subclade itself. So, as they say in Kerry, there you have it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, Finbar, and Nigel. I think it's absolutely awesome, the amount of work that you have done. And I think it's very humbling for a genetic genealogist like me to see the quality and the scientific rigor with which you've attacked this project. So I really praise you all for the amount of hard work that you've actually put into this project. I think it's really fantastic. Now, I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. Who would like to kick off? We have a question over here.
Okay, now I'm speaking from ignorance, right? But this is all to do with Y chromosome. Where do the women slot in on this?
Well, this study is the Men of Munster. So at this stage, at least, we don't have the energy to try to split our direction and include the women too. They don't follow family lines. You know, the surname changes immediately. So it's a different kettle of fish altogether, and it does make it much more difficult. Hopefully we will accept the challenge at some point or get someone else to help us out with that, and we'll give it a try. But one thing I want to mention, because I meant to at the talk and I forgot to, I just want to point out that Nigel was instrumental in being able to identify, codify, and understand the L362 subclade. So he deserves a great deal of credit for having done that. It's really helped us a lot. So thank you.
I would say that all the women of Munster today are in the project because their fathers are in it.
That's a great way of looking at it.
Could I also add that quite a number of women joined the surname projects and testing their family tree DNA family finder. With the mitochondrial DNA, it is difficult, but at least you can make the contribution to the research by joining through the family finder test, which is autosomal. My own mitochondrial DNA is H6A1A, which says, ladies, a lot of you are, so we share the same mitochondrial DNA. But you see, the difficulty is it only survives in the male for one generation. You see, the next time it's passed on from my wife passed on TB2 to my son. So that's a difficulty, but the family finder is the route to go on that one.
Do you allow autosomal testing in the project?
No, they say best to do one thing supremely well than many things badly. So.
We have another question here.
I noticed at the beginning of the talk you had a long list of surnames that you were interested in.
Right.
If I had a McGillicuddy that was interested in testing, what is it, just the Y-DNA 37, or does he have to test SNPs? And if so, I have no idea which one or what you would do.
Well, you start with the 37 marker, and we'll go from there.
It would be the Y. It would be the Y that we're looking at.
Yeah.
It would definitely be the Y we're looking at. We'd love to have McGillicuddy because of the supposed relation to O'Sullivan's.
Oh, it's not supposed, it's definitely.
Well, yeah.
I can represent that remark.
Sorry. Well, you said yourself you never know what you're going to get when you test.
That's true too.
There is. I'm aware of one McGill. I'm not aware of any McGillicuddies that have tested. I'm aware of one McGill who does tie in with the O'Sullivans very well on the O'Sullivan tree. But yes, a Y test, 37. But to be honest, I mean, if you can afford it, we'd rather you did 67 because the more markers you test, the more information we have. And SMPs will follow on from testing the STRs.
You look after that.
Just a very short answer to Cliona. My second great grandfather is a Florence McGillicuddy. Cliona's, if you don't mind me saying so, father-in-law is also Florence McGillicuddy. There's an interesting point. Nigel mentioned it. Some of the McGillicuddys who left Killarney and went to Kenmare actually shortened their name to McGill anyway. So, you know, name change, follow the DNA. Start with the 37. There is actually a McGillicuddy project, Y-DNA surname project, and the more people who join, the better. I think the DNA finds itself. I was also one of the executive directors of the Clans of Ireland, and about 3 or 4 years ago, as I was processing into the Oak Room in the Mansion House, who was I walking next to but the representative of the McGillicuddy. I think we find one another, okay?
I think I just want to clarify something because I don't think I fully answered. You do the STR test, that's the normal entry thing. We'd recommend then you do certain SNP tests. We don't do that for you. I mean, it doesn't come out of the STR test. FTDNA will give you a prediction, and if we're what we expect, the prediction would be that you are RM269, which is R1A1B2. But that is something like 10,000 years old. That is very ancient. That's a safe prediction. We would predict probably, if we expecting what you will be, we will probably predict, or could well predict, you'll be positive for CTS 4466 or one of the other SNPs alongside it. But you would have to go away and test that, add that to your testing. It's not something we...
one specifically?
Well,
You can.
you start with the 37 marker. We, on the results, or preferably 67, but on that result, we would recommend, in many cases, we think you look like you're positive for this, and we would recommend that. But if, in fact, it was not quite what we're expecting from McGillicuddy, it could be very, we could say, well, it looks like RL21, but we don't know which of these many SNPs. We can't really predict it based on your results, maybe even at 67. In that case, to really make progress, we would probably recommend you take a much more expensive test, such as the Geno 2.0, which would look at a whole range of SNPs and would define you, and we'd work away from there.
Did you have another question related to that?
Actually, yeah, explicitly related to that. Finbar, I was intrigued at some of the comments during the presentation, and I just wonder, when you say you recommend, mechanically then, if I as an individual have tested and turned up a particular result that may be of interest to you, do you come back to me and suggest then that I put my hand in my pocket?
That's very easy to do.
Be nice, Finbar, be nice.
In my early days, I was very enthusiastic in making recommendations. I'm very cautious now. It's basically on the basis of what Nigel has said. You've got to be reasonably sure that given the spread of markers that your results would show, we would recommend. We have no vested interest other than in the research, because testing can be very expensive. The latest test I did, the full Y genome, cost $1,250. But I don't smoke, I don't drink. I'm getting too old to chase women. They can run too fast. Sorry, I'm married 44 years to the same woman, and I love her dearly. But that's my hobby since I gave up being totally obsessed with postal history. I spend it in testing myself for others. So, but caution is the word. If you're not going to have any benefit from the testing, why spend the money on that? Now, the researchers will say to it, even a negative result tells us something, but for the individual in question, you might think it money down the drain, okay?
I'll just add to that. If you test an individual SNP, if we suggest you test a specific individual SNP, that is $39, which is, 32 euros, something like 32 euros. As I say, the Geno 2.0 is $200, which is about 150 euros. But it depends exactly what your STRs tell us. And as I say, we can get it wrong, but we can make recommendations. We can't say you must do, and we don't want to spend people's money unnecessarily. We're trying to make an economic recommendation. It's hit and miss, DNA, we could get things wrong. Most times we get it right, most times we're fairly safe. I've only actually on the McCarthy project, which I've only ever made one recommendation to somebody saying, I think you should test this, and he turned out negative. But this was a few years ago. This was L159.2 Irish C. Since then, an earlier SNP in the same lineage has been discovered, Z255. I'm quite sure he'll be positive for that. But I'm loath to tell him, try this one, and just in case he came negative on that. But that's going to be the solution. But we do our best, as if it was our own money.
One thing I might add is Morris makes his way down to another lady who wants to ask a question, is that there is a project, the R-L21 project. Remember that vast chart that Nigel showed at one point. There are several administrators to that project, and I have in the past recommended, if I wasn't really sure myself, maybe it was somebody in my own project, the Eoghanacht project as opposed to the Munster. If they join that project, the administrators there will research, compare, because it's, how many thousands are in there now? It's quite big. That they try to put people into clusters, even if they haven't been tested beyond L21. So if they identify that you belong in this particular cluster, that would suggest a particular SNP that you might be positive for. So there are times when that kind of thing works well as well, when we don't really know ourselves for sure, but they have a different way of looking at it, or a broader way of looking at it. So that could help you as well.
And these project admins are very responsive to emails, so if you have a question, you email them, and they will certainly come back with a reply. Jared.
I will probably join your group, as I'm one of the names on your list, which you showed up there, but I'm also Eli O'Carroll, right? And I'm currently in the DF21 group, and the DF21 group currently has about 7 levels below it, so we have a lot of granularity. But the latest results coming out this weekend in the full genome are indicating a 10-fold expansion of the SNPs, right? Which will give us an awful lot more detail to work with. Of course, many of them today are private SNPs or SNPs, but as they cluster with other people, we're going to be able to identify people names. Another recent, there are a lot of interesting projects just happening in the last few weeks. National Geographic tested in Mayo, and they also tested in Asturias, right? The preliminary indications of that are very, very interesting. And they're sort of pushing the defining mutations of L21 further out to the west and towards Iberia. So that's quite interesting.
Great.
The second thing was 2 weeks ago we had the HAC-AL study, which again was showing that we know that R1b had a major expansion in the Neolithic, but it also had a secondary expansion associated with the bell beakers out of Iberia, right? So this is all very interesting, and hopefully as we get more detail, we'll be able to tell more stories around that. One recommendation would be probably just to write to Spencer Wells and ask him to test a bunch of people down in Munster. He did 100 people in Mayo, so he may be interested in doing 100 people in Munster. Second suggestion is next year is the millennium of the Battle of Clontarf, the Dalcassians and the men of Munster, right? So that's something maybe you should be thinking of publishing around that date.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jared. There's a lady over here with a question. Wasn't there? Oh, yeah.
Again, speaking as a novice, I was interested in the O'Driscoll, because obviously that would be my family. I got the impression they were not in under the South Irish types, or is that, or did I misunderstand?
There are some that are. That's what's so curious, because the South Irish, as I think it was Nigel pointed out, has absolutely nothing to do with the I-clades that most of the O'Driscolls belong to. Now, I know that there are some places where they suggest that the O'Driscoll is a Cruthan, a Pict, which kind of makes sense with the eyes. But then it's probable that even if they are, that there's certainly a certain collection of O'Driscolls as well who are South Irish, who took the name O'Driscoll, but really were more indigenous tribes of, you know, that South Irish cluster rather than anything coming down from the north.
And just on that, it's important to realise, and I think Jared mentioned it as well, the South, the people of the South of Ireland, as opposed to the South Irish, you know, the early inhabitants would have, some of them would have arrived to mine in Mount Gabriel and further west out towards the Mizzen. And the suggestion is that the early traces of those people still exist along that strip. You know? So you've got an ancient heritage, an ancient association with the country as one possibility. The other possibility is that they would have been late arrivals via the Vikings, but I don't accept or like that argument. It's not that I don't accept it, I don't like it. Okay? Because, yeah, my second great grandmother came from the Sheep's Head Peninsula, so I'm all in favour of the West Cork people, okay?
Yeah, I did say that the O'Driscolls are at 55% I2A. So there's still another 45%. We do have some which are the South Irish or Irish type 2. I know of one O'Driscoll who was the L362, the Munster type 1. Well, when I say L362, he's on the borderline. I'd love him to take an SNP test because he's right on the borderline. It could have been before L362 occurred or after. And it would be quite informative for him to test. But there's just one. So it just shows, and there is no doubt other O'Driscolls who have other haplotypes altogether. It's only 55% have the I2A, but again, it's like the founder. As I said early on, that if the name is monogenetic, there is usually between 50 and 60% of people will go back to have common ancestry consistent with that being a founder in the first millennium, or late first millennium.
Great. Any other questions? I have one question here at the back, and this will be the last one, and then we'll have the Ask the Experts session, and hopefully some of Elizabeth and Finbar and Nigel will be able to stay behind for us.
I'd just like to ask you what became of the Atlantean Irish argument and the idea of traces of our ancestry outside of Europe and into Europe. You know,
I don't exactly understand how you mean that.
Bob Quinn, the Atlantean Irish, the Moroccan elements, the Berber migrating tribes, the Shano singing and everything. You know?
Yeah, yes, I met Bob Quinn.
Yes, Bob Quinn did a series of documentaries back in the 80s, I think it was, 90s. Yeah, and he had a fascinating theory about how the Irish were a seafaring nation because, of course, the whole of the land was covered with forest. So they connected by sea. But there's a lot of similarities between North Africa, even as far as the Eastern Europe, in terms of the language, the singing, and various other aspects of culture, which suggested that there might have been some kind of fertilization all across that particular part of the world. Finbar, what do you think?
Yes, I met Bob Quinn, and I greeted him very warmly as Michael Morris, who was a colleague of mine. They just look similar. But anyway, the interesting point here is that I've been, I know that others have been to Morocco as well. I've been to Agadir in particular. I've listened to the Moroccan music. I could see where his train of thought came from, but I don't think the evidence really supports the argument. The DNA evidence certainly doesn't support any major links. And I think, as George just said earlier, if we're going to look for any real links, we probably will be surprised pleasantly when that study is announced later on in the month. it's easy to look at romantic associations and to see similarities. But if you want to trace anything, I think the best thing to do is to look at the archaeology, look at the loosely described Celtic monuments or the megalithic monuments and see associations based on archaeology rather than music that sounds vaguely familiar to Shanos. Okay, I'm not dismissing it, but pardon? Possibly, but possibly, yeah. That's a much more logical argument, I would think. That, yeah, exactly, yeah. For example, if you go to the island in Loch Corrib, there's the stone there in on the island, which people thought was all the way back to the time of Noah's daughter. We have all these arguments and stories and myths, but basically I think the associations could more likely be based on trading links, routes, and the old pathways back right to megalithic times and the mining or the Belbeaker people and all of those associations.
I will make one point that I think is relevant for the Irish. They do like to travel. We have the Irish travelers, but beyond that, I think they just were very peripatetic. And the possibility of them going down to North Africa and that's not so hard to believe. If there's not that much genetic evidence, well, there's not really a whole lot of DNA testing done for that area of the world either. So if that ever would begin, we might find something very interesting.
And I think that's one of the joys of working with DNA and being involved in genetic genealogy is that it is allowing us to revisit a lot of the old myths, the old genealogies, things that we thought were possibly just legend, and they'll actually throw fresh light on things that have been maybe lost in the past for the last couple of decades. So it only remains for me to thank this wonderful panel for sharing their wisdom and their expertise with us. And please can I ask you to show your appreciation in the usual way.
Thanks for letting us go over so much.